Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into one of the most foundational stories in human history, but we're going to look at it from a totally different angle: the fall of man.
We usually think of the story of Adam and Eve as a tragedy, right? A huge, terrible mistake. But what if it wasn't? The source material we're looking at today, especially texts like the Book of Moses, makes a fascinating argument that the fall wasn't an accident at all, but was actually a necessary and even deliberately designed step in God's plan for all of us.
So, the idea here is that this whole event was completely premeditated. And to pull it off, the stage had to be set just right. It actually needed four crucial components to create the perfect conditions for choice that would literally change the world. So think of it like a recipe. Here are the four key ingredients the source lays out. First, you need a knowing couple who kind of understood what was supposed to happen. Second, a very obvious, prominent temptation placed right out in the open. Third, a really strange, paradoxical command that both forbids something and allows it at the same time. And finally, you need an unwitting catalyst to kick the whole thing into gear. So let's start by digging into those first three pieces that God put on the board. Okay, first up, this view argues that Adam and Eve weren't just naive innocents, they were married, and that union, by its very nature, points toward having kids and living a mortal life. This suggests they had some understanding that their time in the garden was temporary and that a fall into our world was an expected, even necessary part of the whole divine plan. And ingredient number two, the tree that would cause all this change? It wasn't hidden away in some dark, spooky corner of the garden. Nope. The tree of knowledge of good and evil was planted right in the heart of Eden. Easy to see and easy to get to. It was almost like an invitation, a clear focal point for the massive decision they had to make. All right, the third ingredient is this paradoxical commandment. I mean, just look at the wording here. Thou mayest choose for thyself, but in the very next breath, but remember that I forbid it. The source interprets this not as just a simple don't do it, but as a deliberate setup that explicitly gives them agency, the ability to choose, while also laying down a clear law. It's a choice that's literally embedded inside of a command. Wild, right? Okay, so here's the crucial point. You have these first three ingredients all set up, but Adam and Eve still wouldn't have acted. They respected the command. So a fourth element was needed, an outside force, really, to provide the push and get the ball rolling.
And this is where Lucifer becomes the unwitting catalyst. From his point of view, he was there to wreck God's creation, pure and simple. It was all about pride. But from God's perspective, that same raw ambition was the perfect tool to kickstart the next phase of the plan for humanity. So Lucifer thought he was destroying the plan, but he was actually starting it.
This quote right here, he knew not the mind of God, it really gets to the core of the irony, doesn't it? Lucifer, just totally blinded by his own agenda, had no idea that his attempt to derail everything was the exact catalyst needed to move it forward. He was playing his part perfectly, and he never even understood the script.
Now, Lucifer's approach had to be really cunning. The source points out that Adam and Eve knew who he was, so he couldn't just stroll up and have a chat. He had to be indirect, so he chose to speak through a serpent, one of the more subtle creatures in the garden.
So the serpent's opening line, it wasn't a direct temptation. It was this subtle, manipulative question. The source explains this was designed to put Eve on the defensive, to make her start justifying God's commandment and her own obedience to it. It's a classic debate tactic.
And once Eve engaged, the serpent went straight for the attack. This line is a direct, flat-out contradiction of God's warning. It's a bold move, a direct challenge to divine authority, and it's designed to plant that little seed of doubt. And right after that, he hits her with the ultimate temptation. He completely reframes God's command. He says it's not about protecting them, it's about God selfishly holding them back. He argued that the fruit would unlock their true potential, make them as gods, and give them the very knowledge they were supposed to get anyway. And you have to admit, the logic was pretty compelling. Eve knew they were supposed to gain knowledge, and hey, there's the tree of knowledge right in front of her. The serpent's argument that this was the key, plus the insinuation that God was holding out on them, well, it proved to be too persuasive, so she partook of the fruit. Eve has now made her choice, but she was deceived. And this brings us to the final, critical moment of the story, where the entire future of the plan rests on a conscious, fully aware choice that has to be made by Adam.
So when Eve presents the fruit to Adam, it's immediately clear to him what happened. She'd been tricked by a really clever argument. She had partaken, but with a kind of experimental curiosity.
But Adam, he was not deceived. The source material is really emphatic about this. He understood the situation perfectly. He knew exactly what the consequences of partaking were, and this put him in a truly impossible dilemma.
I mean, really try to put yourself in his shoes for a second. If he refuses the fruit, he stays in paradise, but he stays there alone, while Eve goes into mortality. They would be separated forever. And that primary commandment they were given, to have children and start the human family, would be impossible to fulfill. The entire plan would just stop. The Apostle Paul is actually quoted in the source to highlight this exact point. And notice the crucial distinction here. Eve was in the transgression because she was deceived. Adam's choice, on the other hand, would be a transgression made with full conscious knowledge of exactly what was at stake.
And so Adam consciously chose to eat the fruit. He didn't do it out of weakness or because he was tricked. He did it out of love and commitment, to stay with Eve and to make sure the divine plan for all of us could actually move forward. In this view, he chose mortality with her over a lonely, static paradise without her.
And that leaves us with this final, provocative question. When you look at it through this lens, was the fall a tragic mistake, or was it a necessary, deliberate, and maybe even heroic step forward? A transgression that made the entire human story possible. That's the perspective from our source material today. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.